Kelsey Skoke had a pornography addiction. Yes, she, not he. So how did she overcome it? What advice does she have for you so you can live in freedom? And how can we convince young women to save sex for marriage? This is Dive Deep. From the Diocese of Springfield in Illinois, this is Dive Deep. We dive deep into our Catholic faith. I am Andrew Hansen. Kelsey Skoke, she's an international speaker and author. We are so pleased to have her to come on Dive Deep. And she's going to talk about avoiding temptation, especially when it comes to pornography and masturbation. Ultimately, how did she overcome that? What tips does she have for you if you're struggling with that? And also, we're going to talk to her about the culture at large, especially what do women who want those beautiful relationships, what are the warning signs they need to be on the lookout for so they can enter into that beautiful marriage? Kelsey, thanks for coming on Dive Deep. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so excited to have you here and hear your story. Your testimony is going to help so many of our listeners. And when we think about your testimony, let's start first with your story, because I think in our culture, when you hear the words or the phrases, I'm addicted to porn or I'm addicted to pleasuring myself, it's always a male thing.
Right, yeah.
But for you, it was a female thing. So tell us your story.
Yeah, so I think I had that impression too. Growing up, I wasn't fully ingrained in the faith. And as I started learning more about my faith at the end of high school and into college, I knew that, what I was watching or my behavior wasn't maybe what the church would teach is okay, but I'd always heard it from the male perspective, like, oh, well, that's something the men do, and kind of what I was doing wasn't as bad. And so, a lot of times people think of pornography as, the X-rated videos. In my mind, it was like those video stores behind the curtain type stuff, right? And so what I was doing, like searching for videos online or like looking at kissing scenes, romantic sex scenes from movies, like, oh, this is an X-rated pornography website, this is totally fine. And so starting to watch those videos and starting to allow it to affect my behavior and struggling with masturbation just became a part of my life. And I honestly had no idea that it wasn't okay in the eyes of the church. And I fell into a lot of the beliefs of the world of like, this was just me exploring my sexuality. This was just me as a woman, like knowing what my preferences were, knowing like that I'm a sexual woman and that's okay, right? And falling into all of that. And it wasn't until kind of the end of college when I started to really actually get into my prayer life and start getting involved more in my faith at the Catholic Center on our campus, where I went to a talk and they mentioned chastity and they started teaching the principles of JP2 and what our bodies are made for. And I questioned, okay, maybe what I'm doing really isn't okay. And they talked about addiction as essentially anything that we put before God. And I thought, well, I'm just doing this. This is my own free choice. So I thought, well, I'll prove the church wrong. It's always good when you say that. I'll prove the church wrong. I'm going to give this up for Lent, and if it's easily done, I'm proving that I'm not addicted. This is my choice, and I'm not putting it before God. And if that's easily done, then I can continue at my own discretion. And so that year, entering in, a couple weeks in, didn't think about it. 3 weeks in, I started thinking about it all the time. And I started having to create avenues and ways to get out of my apartment and figure out what I was going to do with my schedule because it started to consume me. And I started to realize how it shifted my view of other men and other women, just my relationships in general. And that was kind of the beginning of my story because I remember thinking, dang, I'm addicted. I have an addiction because I couldn't keep from falling into it. And so I walked into my first ever confession with the priest, sharing with him that this is something that I struggled with. And that is the beginning of my journey of figuring out, okay, how do I actually now root this out, right? Because I wish I could tell you, okay, from that confession I went on and never struggled with these things ever again, but nope, that was the beginning of my journey.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of the physical and emotional. I want to get a little bit more into that. Yeah. Obviously, struggling with addiction, especially when it comes to these acts of impurity, impact us spiritually. But how did it impact you physically, emotionally, psychologically? Were you almost rationalizing? Were you tricking yourself into some things and you thought you had wholesome relationships maybe with others, or even you thought, me and myself, we're good, when actually you weren't?
Yeah, I think you can rationalize pretty much anything in your life, and I definitely justified a lot of things I was doing. But for me, it was more, everything was compartmentalized, and I just separated it, right? Like this is what I did in my own time, in my own bedroom, whatever. And these relationships weren't touched by that. That was for me. And a lot of times with this particular addiction, we don't think it affects anyone else because it's just something that we're doing or experiencing. But it does. Kind of what I mentioned in my story, it changed how I viewed people. And it wasn't until I removed it fully from my life until I saw, wow, I'm actually over-sexualizing people, or I'm looking for, you almost have to experience it to know what I'm talking about. But once you remove whatever it is that you're addicted to, and you kind of go through the withdrawal, is when you notice what you had been using as like kind of a compensation for something else, what you've been a tool to numb or whatever. So other things that I had maybe been struggling with and using this as a coping mechanism started coming to the forefront. So it wasn't like that this was necessarily, well, there's a whole bunch of pieces. This was hiding a lot of issues that I hadn't fully taken the time to heal and process and do. And then it was also contributing to my view of relationships, what kind of man I thought I should be dating, my fear of marriage and all of the things going in that. So there was a lot of emotional, physical, I mean, you name it, that it was going on. But until I removed that stimulus, I had no idea really how deep it had gotten in my life.
And when you started dating, and of course now you're married to your husband,
yeah.
Did you guys talk about this? Did it impact your relationship at first, knowing your past? And how did you guys ultimately have that conversation? So of course you had a wholesome relationship, then of course a beautiful marriage.
Right. Well, I would say pornography in general, because our culture can't get away from it. It is everywhere. Every single person has been impacted and affected by pornography. So I would say like it impacts every single relationship. But obviously if you're someone who has had that addiction, or currently or in your past even, it's going to impact your relationship. So yes, I did have conversations with my now husband. I think it was helpful for me because at the time that we started dating, I had already started speaking out about this and helping other women receive healing. So that was a little bit helpful. And it was kind of like he already knew that was part of my story. But I did share my full testimony, even pieces that no one will hear except for him and the Lord. Once we were engaged, I felt like that was a level where we were at a point in our relationship where I was ready to unveil even more for him. I usually recommend for people in relationships, like, there comes a point when you're dating and you're shifting into boyfriend-girlfriend status where there's like the conversation of boundaries and where we want to be, or what are our limitations. And that's a great opportunity to say, in all areas of chastity, I want to make sure that we're both seeking freedom, that we both have accountability. And that includes the physical chastity between you and I, the personal chastity with pornography and masturbation. Those are things that are really important to me to make sure that I'm in full freedom, and the person that I'm potentially discerning marriage with is also seeking full freedom. How do you feel about that? And you kind of leave it open-ended. You're not saying, is this something you struggle with? You're just saying, hey, do you have accountability in all areas of chastity? Because that is a priority for me in my relationships. And so that's kind of a good way to break the ice for anyone who's kind of debating that.
What about someone who says, Kelsey, I masturbate sometimes, I'm not addicted to it. Of course it feels good. But health experts sometimes say, this is actually good for you. And, keeping it bottled up inside. I mean, look at you, Kelsey. You had to create diversions left and right. It sounds like, what's wrong with doing it every once in a while?
Yeah. Well, I would argue if someone's saying like once in a while, well, there could still be an addiction there. Because if it's something that you're desiring to do, I would challenge that person to say like, okay, then maybe don't do it. See what happens. Because while it might seem like it's a once in a while thing, for women, I often talk about our cycles play a huge role in the temptations that occur for this. For men, there's certain things that they have to go through and figure out day in and day out. But women, hormonally, there's going to be times of our cycle in which we're desiring a relationship where we're desiring this type of pleasure in a certain way more so than others. And so the once a month hurdle for women could still actually be an addiction because they haven't learned how to monitor their emotions, their hormonal cycle in a way that they can say no even when the temptation is great. And so for those people though that you mentioned that are like, this is totally fine because this is just a healthy release to my body. I don't know of anyone who like spontaneously combusted because they didn't masturbate. Contrary to popular belief, I don't think that's a thing. And I think there's a lie. I once gave a talk to co-ed and I had a male counterpart, and one guy raised his hand and said, I heard you can get testicular cancer if you don't masturbate regularly. This was a lie that he had been told and believed. And so it's crazy, as we share it here, but people believe that there's this bottling up experience that you just need to release. And while the action is a release, yes, there is an intimacy that it's designed for, because the chemicals that are released in your brain when you're doing these activities, you get a dopamine hit, which is nice, right? Like that's the feeling good chemical in your brain. but there's oxytocin released as well, and that is the relationship bonding chemical in your brain. And so think about what you're doing over and over and over again. You're bonding yourself to no one. And that can create a lot of issues long term that you don't realize the impact initially. You don't realize how that's psychologically affecting you. You don't realize how that's making you self-dependent and not able to enter into true intimacy with another. And I think everyone could say they desire happiness, they desire to feel loved, they desire to love another and with their whole self. But unfortunately, with people with these addictions, oftentimes you get into marriages and these things just come in like a wrecking ball. And they think, once I'm married, then I'm not going to worry about that, right? I'll have the release through sex, it'll be fine. But no, they still have that addictive nature because you have conditioned your brain and these chemical releases incorrectly. And it takes a long time. It takes years of processing that, figuring out how to remove some of the images that you've seen, or even just how your body naturally prefers to be stimulated in that way, and can cause those issues as well.
We see the culture right now, Kelsey, setting so many traps for women. Both they want a good relationship, or maybe they're in a current relationship right now. They want that healthy relationship. What traps do you see out there that what the culture is telling women that they should avoid? What should women be on the lookout for so they can avoid these traps, so they ultimately can find that freedom and that healthy relationship they want?
Yeah, good, the traps. Oh gosh, I honestly think that women, first and foremost, need to encounter the Lord. They need to encounter their relationship with Jesus, because all these things that we're talking about here are symptoms of a greater desire that is not being met. And so what happens is we're made for a relationship with our Creator, which is so beautiful. But unfortunately, if we aren't tapping into that, we start grasping in all these other areas in the world, and especially the world telling us, here, this will give you happiness, this will give you what you want, this is going to be an easy, quick fix in that desire that you're feeling of relationship. Here it is, here it is, here it is. And so women are grasping, and sometimes they'll even grasp at a relationship that they know they're not supposed to be in, right? They'll be dating kind of the not so good guy or whatever it is, and they know they're worth more, but they want to feel the love. And that's not a bad thing, because it's what we're made for. We're made for a relationship with our Creator. And so to not fall into the traps, it's really to develop and cultivate that relationship with our Creator, because then when you see the counterfeit and you experience that day in and day out, you're like, boy, please. I know whose I'm made for, and I know my worth, and I know the relationship that I deserve. And so that would be the easiest way to not fall into any traps, is to keep your eyes on the ultimate relationship.
Now, for our listeners who have young daughters or granddaughters, of course, if someone listening or watching right now who is wanting that beautiful marriage, our culture also talks greatly about have sex before marriage. It's freedom. This is,
You gotta try the car before you buy it.
Yes.
Yes.
What do you say? What's your pitch to our young women to say, I know the culture, maybe even your friends are peer pressuring you, it's okay to have sex before marriage. Why ultimately should a woman, if you were to speak to her one-on-one, should she save herself for marriage?
I think it comes back to so many deeper things that are at play there, because it's not just about having sex. I think that's kind of what the world wants to make it seem. When you talk about what sex is and how truly beautiful, sex is not bad. Sometimes the church, people get this rep of like, oh, the church is all these things saying no, and you shouldn't do this, no to this, no to this. And the church is honestly saying yes to so many good things. JP2, I think, is attributed for a quote of saying, the problem with pornography is not that it reveals too much, is that it reveals too little. And that there's so much more that the sacredness of the sexual act provides. And if you look at a husband giving himself completely to his spouse, and a woman receiving her spouse in that way fully, it's Trinitarian. It's the way that the Lord pours his love out to us in the sacrifice of the cross, and we receive his love. And through that relationship, divine life is created. Just like, you've got Father, Son, creates the Holy Spirit. You've got the husband, the wife, and hopefully new life can be created. And so when you talk about the truth of what the sexual act is and what it's for, and anytime I share this with a young woman, you can see their hearts are set on fire. They know that that's what they're made for. They know that that's what they want. And again, going back to you can see the counterfeit. What you need to do is, if you continue to read truth and be reminded of the design of our bodies and what it's for, it's not just I mean, there's so many bad theology or bad chastity talks out there of like, I heard one that was like, oh, it's like duct tape and you stick yourself and then eventually the tape doesn't stick or whatever that bogus thing. Like, I mean, I know what they're trying to get at, and they don't want you to be overly bonding with too many people, and that actually can cause heartbreak in a way that you're not made for. But it's much more than that. It's because every act in and of itself is an experience of the Trinity. And I know like people who might be listening and might be like, okay, what has she been on? I don't know. But that is the reality. And when we're called to a vocation of marriage, new life should be a part of that. And so I think that's why I mentioned there's so much more to that issue. Is it's generally because someone hasn't learned the truth, beauty, and goodness of what the sexual act is for and what marriage is for. I mean, I talk to women who've had sex, and I'm like, okay, so then like the next day, how do you feel? They're like, oh, well, I feel loved and all these things. I'm like, no, like you're at home and he hasn't texted you. How do you feel? Right? Because there's no full commitment. They haven't given their entire life for you. Are you questioning if you were good? Are you questioning, like, there's so many doubts and insecurities that spring up from that shouldn't be a part of it. Because when you do it in the way that the Lord has designed, being total, being faithful, allowing it to be fruitful, to have that fullness of everything that the Lord has designed for it, it's safe, it's secure, you feel so loved, and you just, it's so much more. And yeah, so that's it. Instead of just talking about the no, I want to talk about the yes and what we're saying yes to. And then people are like, yeah, I don't want this anymore. I want that.
We'll get you out on this one. So let's finish your story. How did you ultimately break your addiction?
Yep.
And what tips do you have for women and men, of course, who are struggling with, of course, whether it's pornography addiction, masturbation, or if you just kind of addiction in general to the pleasures of the world?
Right. So in my book, I kind of outline a few different steps, but the nature of it is, I mentioned Jesus, bringing Jesus into it, going through your own story. So when were you first exposed, and bringing Jesus into that. I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, Jesus, he doesn't want to know about this. This is too shameful. I can't imagine that he'd ever want to be part of this. And I often talk to women and I said, where was Jesus when you were first exposed? Yeah, he wasn't in the room. He was like across the highway. And I'm like, no, he was sitting right there screaming on the top of his lungs. He was heartbroken that this was happening to you. And I think when you realize that the Lord is with you in this, that he has seen what our over-sexualized culture has done to you, he is not wagging his finger and saying like, how could you do such something so horrible? He's saying, how could the world do this to my precious child? And he's weeping and he's wanting, and then you can create this like, okay, we're in this together. This is the relationship I was made for. When I'm grasping at these behaviors and these things I'm watching, it's because this is what I need. So that, first and foremost, restoring that, and then going in your life and going, okay, when am I most triggered? When are the times where I have the highest temptations? For women, looking at your cycle, tracking it, being able to recognize those changes and those temptations, figuring out, everyone's story is so unique. And so then monitoring yourself, removing the things that you know are going to tempt you. And I always say, like, a lot of people, it's the phone next to the bed, right? They're scrolling, they're whatever, they're triggered because they realize they weren't invited to something. I don't know. So why do you have your phone in your bed? Like, well, Kelsey, it's my alarm clock. Well, did you know you can buy those at Walmart for $5? Oh my gosh, it's crazy. It's a whole new thing. So removing those things that might add to those triggers or temptations, and then filling in the good stuff. Adding in coffee dates with friends, going in and developing new hobbies, get out in the world, stop, being here, because that only isolates you further and perpetuates this addiction and these triggers. And then I always say, like, spiritual direction, confession, counseling, these things are symptoms of greater needs in our life, whether it's spiritual healing or even professional healing of a trauma or something we need to work through. So find the professionals that help you seek the healing you deserve.
Some excellent advice. Kelsey Skoke, thanks for coming on Dive Deep.
Yes, thanks for having me.
You're welcome.